if the Ukrainians are on the front foot, and that's a big, big if, but if the Ukrainians can somehow halt the Russian advance and even make some progress themselves in the next month or two, Trump is faced with a very different proposition. He's faced with a proposition where it's the Ukrainians that are ascendant, and that changes the dynamic of those early negotiations. So I take a more charitable view of why Joe Biden might have done this.
James Heappey was Armed Forces Minister in the last government. He's here with us in the studio. James, good morning to you.
Morning.
I don't know how freely you are to speak. You're no longer in government. You're no longer connected to the Ministry of Defence. It's a funny old thing that we all know storm shadows have been used. We've seen the evidence. We knew they were going to be used, but no one can quite admit it. Are we allowed to say confidently they have been used by Ukrainians, provided by the British government?
Well, if they have been used, I don't think the MOD will be remotely shy about saying so at every point thus far when a new capability has been deployed into Ukraine. It tends to be that no fanfare is made of the decision, but it is announced once it has been used.
So it might get confirmed later today, you think?
Yeah, maybe. And do always be suspicious of the Russian disinformation capability. But whether or not one was used yesterday or whether it's used for the first time today or tomorrow, my suspicion is it's only a matter of time, given the change in the US position.
And that's the key thing here, isn't it? When you were in government, would you have wanted to get Storm Shadows to Ukrainians sooner?
Yeah. I mean, look, we did. Ben Wallace drove Storm Shadow incredibly hard. And he could see that Russia was adapting its tactics and moving its command and control and its logistics depots further rearwards to get out of the range of the rocket artillery that we provided quite early in the war. And then there was a debate about whether or not Storm Shadow could be used into Crimea. It was very successfully, took out a number of Russian ships and even a submarine. And then since then, the question has been, when can it start to be used onto Russian soil to get after the airfields from which the planes are launching that are dropping these devastating glide bombs, and of course to get after the logistics and the command and control that is now even further rearwards.
And who stopped that? And ultimately, would that become a decision? So you've provided the weapons. Is that an American decision then?
Well, look, it's a combination of an American decision and an internal decision within the British government. And there's no, government conversations tend to play to stereotype. Knuckle-headed defence ministers like me are like, yeah, let's do it. This is the right thing to do. And foreign office ministers and prime ministers have a slightly sort of more nuanced view. That's the richness of government decision making.
You came on the programme, James, when you were defence minister, and you said, I'm very happy for Western ordnance to be used in Russia.
Yeah.
And it got written up in the New York Times as, on Times Radio, British minister is too bullish. I mean, so yeah. you clearly were up for it in a way that... So someone was stopping that.
Look, I mean, I could always... For me, it was about the military logic. So, you can have a highly attritional fight on the front line between ever greater bodies of men just kind of running at each other, First World War style. Or you use sophisticated weapon systems that can go at range and with precision to take out the stuff that grinds an army to a standstill. If an army has no food, has no fuel, has no ammunition, the army isn't going anywhere. So it always made sense to me to support a numerically inferior Ukrainian army with the technological advantage that the West has by providing the weapon systems.
So why didn't that happen, Jack? I'm just trying to understand that. Is it the US? Because Biden seems to have changed his mind.
Yeah.
And so are you saying that a year ago, Biden wouldn't have really wanted this to happen, and then a week ago, he's changed his mind?
Yeah, I think I am saying that. I think a year ago, there would have been no chance. Even if the case had been made within the British government. And I'm not sure that a year ago there was consensus in the British government. But Biden simply wasn't in that place. Once he made the decision that ATACMS, the US version of Storm Shadow, could be used, and then subsequently, therefore, Storm Shadow could be used, that's a big moment. It's very welcome. I know that some people have taken a slightly cynical view that this is a way of Biden just sort of making life difficult for his successor. I take a more charitable view. Donald Trump has set out his position on Ukraine. He may or may not do it as abruptly as he's said he will. But if the Ukrainians are on the front foot, and that's a big, big if, but if the Ukrainians can somehow halt the Russian advance and even make some progress themselves in the next month or two, Trump is faced with a very different proposition. He's faced with a proposition where it's the Ukrainians that are ascendant, and that changes the dynamic of those early negotiations. So I take a more charitable view of why Joe Biden might have done this.
All right, we really value your insight on this, James. I want one last thing to talk about, because we've been talking to Ukrainians for 2.5 years, however long it's been, and they've always said, we're going to win. We're going to win, we're going to win, we're going to win, we're going to win, which is what you say when you're fighting a war. It's both propaganda and self-belief, and you have to say that.
Yeah.
It just feels vanishingly unlikely that a victory of Ukraine, where there are no Russians in Crimea and there are no Russians in the Donbass region, it feels vanishingly unlikely that's going to happen. So do we need to stop thinking, what does victory now look like? What does good now look like? Unless you can say to me, I actually think that's possible. There's going to be a Ukrainian territory cleared of Russians. What actually is the game in town?
Well, look, if the West went all in its support of Ukraine and really did mobilize its manufacturing base and really did put the money in that was needed, then it is perfectly feasible that the Ukrainians could hold the Russians for another couple of years whilst their rearmament accelerates, and then they could achieve the sort of victory you described. People are very impatient nowadays, but Dunkirk to D-Day was 4 years. It takes time to regrow an army and be ready to retake territory at that scale.
But that's not going to happen, is it?
But if the West is not minded to do that, and my sense is that will is fading, and Trump is a big threshold in that, then we might be entering the endgame. I think that would be sad, and the thing that I think people need to be saying around Trump and in the American media is twofold. Firstly, that a bit like the deal he did over Afghanistan, where there was an immediate success, and so much no more Americans died in Afghanistan after he did the deal, but it set the trajectory for a chaotic withdrawal and where Afghanistan is now. The same is true of any immediate fix in Ukraine. All it will do is give Putin time to rearm and go again, and the cost to Euro-Atlantic security will be enormous. The second point that needs to be made to him is that Euro-Atlantic security and Indo-Pacific security are inextricably linked. We've seen North Korean soldiers crossing the Asian continent into Europe. Sure as night is day, we will see Russian and Iranian capability going the opposite way to support the Chinese. So the US cannot compartmentalize security in Europe and just say that's for the Europeans. We're all about a competition with China. US-China as a competition will be utterly global, and therefore there's no value to Trump in turning his back on Europe.
And that's what makes things so scary for the next couple of years.
Yeah.
James, we always learn something speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
James Heappey there. He was Armed Forces Minister in the last government.